Margaret had always been proud of her son David. At 60 years old, she had sacrificed everything to raise him after his father left when he was just 8. She worked double shifts at the local diner, saved every penny for his education, and never once complained about the sleepless nights or the constant worry. Now, at 32, David was a successful lawyer with his own practice, a beautiful house in the suburbs, and everything she had dreamed he would achieve. But somewhere along the way, success had changed him. The humble, grateful boy who used to help her with groceries and call her every Sunday had become distant and cold. Their conversations grew shorter, his visits became rare, and Margaret often felt like she was talking to a stranger wearing her son's face. The breaking point came on a sunny Saturday afternoon when David decided to bring his college friends over to Margaret's small apartment for what he called a nostalgic visit. Margaret was thrilled. She spent the entire morning cleaning, cooking his favorite dishes, and preparing everything perfectly. She even put on her best dress, the navy blue one she saved for special occasions. When David arrived with his 3 friends, all successful professionals like himself, Margaret greeted them warmly at the door. She had prepared a feast: homemade lasagna, garlic bread, fresh salad, and her famous chocolate cake. The apartment smelled wonderful, and she had arranged fresh flowers on the table. "Welcome, welcome," she said, embracing David and extending her hand to his friends. "I'm so happy to meet you all. David has told me so much about you." David barely acknowledged her greeting. He walked past her into the living room, gesturing for his friends to follow. "This is where I grew up," he said with a tone that made Margaret's heart sink. "Not exactly the Ritz, as you can see." His friends laughed politely, but Margaret noticed the uncomfortable glances they exchanged. She tried to brush off the comment and focus on being a good hostess. "Please, everyone sit down. I've made lunch for you all." As they gathered around the small dining table, Margaret served the food with obvious pride. She had spent her entire week's grocery budget on this meal, wanting everything to be perfect for David's friends. "I hope you like Italian food," she said warmly. "David always loved my lasagna when he was growing up." "Oh, this looks great, Mrs. Patterson," said James, one of David's friends. "Thank you so much for going to all this trouble," Margaret beamed. "It's no trouble at all. I love cooking for people." But David seemed irritated by the attention his mother was receiving. "Mom, why don't you sit down and stop hovering over everyone?" The word hovering stung, but Margaret tried to hide her hurt feelings. She sat down and attempted to join the conversation, asking about their work and families. David's friends were polite and engaged, clearly raised with good manners. As the meal progressed, David's behavior became increasingly dismissive. When Margaret mentioned a funny story from his childhood, he cut her off. "Mom, nobody wants to hear ancient history." When she offered seconds, he snapped, "We're capable of serving ourselves." His friends looked increasingly uncomfortable, but Margaret continued trying to salvage the situation. She brought out photo albums, thinking David's friends might enjoy seeing pictures from his school days. This was apparently the last straw for David. "Mom, seriously, put those away," he said sharply. "My friends didn't come here for a slide show of my awkward teenage years. I just thought," Margaret began. "Well, don't think," David interrupted. "Just let us eat in peace." The room fell silent. Margaret felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she quietly put the albums away and returned to her seat. David's friends looked mortified, but none of them said anything. As the afternoon wore on, David's disrespectful comments continued. He criticized the apartment's outdated furniture, made jokes about the vintage appliances, and even commented on how the neighborhood had gone downhill. Each remark was like a knife to Margaret's heart, especially delivered in front of strangers. When Margaret accidentally knocked over her water glass while reaching for the salt, David rolled his eyes. Dramatically, "Mom, you're such a klutz. This is exactly why I don't bring people over here." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret could see the shock and disapproval in his friend's eyes, but David seemed oblivious to how his behavior was affecting everyone at the table. After lunch, as Margaret quietly cleaned up the dishes, she overheard one of David's friends whisper to him, "Dude, that's your mom. Why are you being so harsh?" David's response made her blood run cold. "You guys don't understand. She's always been needy and embarrassing. I've been dealing with this my whole life." Margaret's hands trembled as she washed the dishes. 32 years of love, sacrifice, and devotion reduced to needy and embarrassing. She thought about all the times she had gone without so he could have what he needed. The second-hand clothes she wore so he could have new school uniforms. The vacations she never took so she could save money for his college fund. When the friends finally left, offering sincere thanks for the meal and apologizing for having to rush off, Margaret found herself alone with David. She hoped he might apologize or at least acknowledge how hurtful his behavior had been. Instead, David looked at his watch and said, "I should get going too. Thanks for lunch, I guess." "David," Margaret said quietly, "why did you treat me that way in front of your friends?" He shrugged. "I was just being honest. You were being your usual self, overly eager and embarrassing. My friends are sophisticated people, Mom. They're not used to this." He gestured dismissively at the apartment. Margaret felt something break inside her chest. "This is the home where I raised you. These hands that you find so embarrassing worked 16-hour days to pay for your education. This heart that you call needy has loved you unconditionally for 32 years. David was already putting on his jacket. "Don't be so dramatic, Mom. I'll call you later." But he didn't call later. He didn't call for weeks. Margaret sat in her small apartment that evening, surrounded by the leftovers from the meal she had prepared. With such love and hope, she looked at the framed photos of David on her mantelpiece. His graduation, his first job, all the proud moments she had celebrated alone because he was too busy to include her. For the first time in her life, Margaret felt truly angry at her son. Not just hurt or disappointed, but genuinely angry. She had given him everything, and in return he had given her humiliation and contempt. As she sat in the growing darkness, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She was done being the grateful, accommodating mother who accepted whatever scraps of attention her son threw her way. It was time for David to learn some hard truths about respect, gratitude, and the real cost of the life he was living. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table staring at the stack of photo albums David had dismissed so cruelly. Each picture told a story of sacrifice and love. Little David in his school play costume she had sewn by hand. David at his high school graduation where she sat alone in the audience because she couldn't afford to invite anyone else. David at his law school ceremony where she had worked extra shifts for months to afford the celebration dinner. By morning, Margaret had made several decisions that would have shocked the woman she was just 24 hours earlier. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. "Sarah, it's Margaret Patterson. I know it's been too long, but I need your help with something." Sarah Henderson had been Margaret's supervisor at the diner 15 years ago, before she left to start her own catering business. She had always told Margaret she had a gift for cooking and hospitality, but Margaret had been too focused on David's needs to consider her own dreams. "Margaret, what a wonderful surprise. What can I do for you?" "I want to know if that offer you made years ago is still open. About working with your catering company." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Margaret, that offer has been open for 15 years. I've been waiting for you to realize your worth. When can you start?" Within a week, Margaret had transformed her life in ways that would have been unimaginable before David's cruel display. She started working part-time for Sarah's catering company, using her natural talent for cooking and event planning. The extra income allowed her to begin renovating her apartment, not for anyone else's approval, but because she deserved a beautiful space. She also made another call that surprised even herself. To David's ex-girlfriend, Jennifer. Jennifer had dated David for 3 years during and after college. Margaret had loved her like a daughter, but when David broke up with Jennifer to focus on his career, he had forbidden Margaret from maintaining contact. "It's weird, Mom," he had said. "You can't stay friends with my ex." But Jennifer answered on the second ring and seemed genuinely happy to hear from her. "Mrs. Patterson, I've missed you so much. How are you?" "I'm well, dear. Listen, I know this might sound strange, but I wanted to apologize for not reaching out sooner." David told me not to contact you after the breakup, and I was wrong to listen. To him, Jennifer's voice softened. He told you not to contact me? Mrs. P, you were like a mother to me. I was heartbroken when I never heard from you again. I thought you blamed me for the breakup. They talked for 2 hours that day, catching up on 5 years of lost friendship. Jennifer was now married to a wonderful man named Michael and had a 2-year-old daughter named Emma. She was also a social worker helping families in crisis. Would you like to meet for coffee sometime? Jennifer asked. I'd love for you to meet Michael and Emma. I would love that more than anything, Margaret replied, feeling lighter than she had in years. As the weeks passed, Margaret's life began to bloom in ways she had forgotten were possible. Her catering work introduced her to new people and gave her a sense of purpose beyond being David's mother. She renovated her apartment with cheerful colors and comfortable furniture that reflected her own taste, not what she thought David would approve of. She reconnected with old friends she had lost touch with during the years of focusing entirely on David's needs. She joined a book club at the local library and discovered a love for mystery novels. She even bought herself new clothes, not practical, serviceable outfits, but beautiful things that made her feel confident and attractive. Most importantly, she began to see herself as Margaret Patterson, not just David's mother. For the first time in decades, she was living for herself. David, meanwhile, was completely oblivious to these changes. He continued his pattern of rare, brief phone calls where he dominated the conversation with complaints about work or casual remarks about his social life. He never asked about Margaret's life or how she was doing, but Margaret was no longer the eager, accommodating woman who had hung on his every word. When he called to complain about a difficult client, she listened politely but didn't offer the unlimited sympathy and advice he was used to. When he mentioned needing his tax documents from previous years, she told him she would look for them when she had time, instead of dropping everything to search immediately. David barely noticed these subtle changes in his mother's responses. He was too self-absorbed to recognize that the woman who had always been available at his convenience was beginning to establish boundaries. The first real test came 6 weeks after the disastrous lunch. David called on a Friday evening, his voice casual and expectant. Hey, Mom, I'm bringing Rebecca over for dinner on Sunday. She's someone I'm seeing, and I want her to try your famous pot roast. In the past, Margaret would have immediately begun planning the menu, shopping list, and cleaning schedule. This time she paused. I'm sorry, David, but I'm not available this Sunday. I have plans. David was clearly taken aback. Plans? What plans? Mom, this is important. Rebecca is... Well, she's important to me. I'm having dinner with Jennifer and her family, Margaret replied calmly. Jennifer? My ex-girlfriend Jennifer? Mom, what the hell are you doing talking to her? Margaret felt a familiar flutter of anxiety at his disapproving tone, but she pushed through it. Jennifer is my friend, David. She has been for years, and I should never have stopped talking to her just because your relationship ended. That's completely inappropriate, Mom. You can't be friends with my ex. It's weird and boundary crossing. The only boundary that was crossed was when I let you dictate who I could and couldn't have in my life, Margaret replied, surprising herself with her firmness. I'm 60 years old, David. I'm perfectly capable of choosing my own friends. David was silent for a long moment, clearly struggling to process this new version of his mother. Fine, then what about next weekend? I really want Rebecca to meet you. I'll check my schedule and let you know, Margaret said. After she hung up, Margaret realized her hands weren't shaking. For the first time in years, she had stood up to David without falling apart. It felt terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. Sunday dinner with Jennifer's family was everything Margaret had forgotten family gatherings could be. Michael was warm and funny, treating Margaret with genuine respect and interest. 2-year-old Emma crawled into Margaret's lap during dessert, and Margaret felt her heart overflow with joy she hadn't experienced in years. You look amazing, Mrs. P, Jennifer said as they cleaned up together. I don't know what you've been doing, but you seem so much happier than the last time I saw you. Margaret smiled. I'm learning to live for myself instead of waiting for someone else's approval. Jennifer studied her face carefully. Does this have something to do with David? Margaret hesitated, then decided honesty was the best policy. David has been taking me for granted for years. I finally realized that unconditional love doesn't mean accepting unconditional disrespect. Jennifer nodded knowingly. I remember how he used to talk to you sometimes. It always bothered me, but I was young and didn't feel like it was my place to say anything. You deserve so much better, Mrs. P. As Margaret drove home that evening, she reflected on how different her life had become in just 6 weeks. She had rediscovered parts of herself that had been buried under years of single-minded devotion to her son's needs and wants. She was still David's mother and always would be, but she was also Margaret, a talented, intelligent, worthy woman with her own dreams and relationships. 3 months after the humiliating lunch incident, Margaret's transformation was complete, though David remained blissfully unaware of the magnitude of change happening in his mother's life. Margaret had become a different woman, confident, independent, and no longer willing to accept scraps of affection from anyone, including her son. Her catering work with Sarah had flourished beyond either of their expectations. Margaret's natural talent for creating memorable experiences, combined with her years of making magic happen on a tight budget, made her invaluable to the business. She had developed a reputation for elegant events that felt warm and personal, rather than stuffy and impersonal. The breakthrough moment came when Margaret was assigned to cater a retirement party for Judge William Morrison, one of the most respected figures in the legal community. The event was held at the country club where David often played golf with clients, though Margaret didn't know this when she accepted the job. Margaret spent weeks planning every detail of Judge Morrison's celebration. She researched his favorite foods, learned about his career accomplishments, and even incorporated personal touches like recreating the menu from his wedding 50 years earlier. The result was an evening that moved the tough old judge to tears. "Young lady," Judge Morrison said to Margaret as the evening wound down, "in 40 years of practicing law, I've attended hundreds of events. This was the most thoughtful and beautifully executed celebration I've ever experienced. You have a remarkable gift." Margaret glowed with pride. For the first time in her adult life, she was receiving recognition for her own talents and hard work, not just for being someone's mother. Word of Margaret's success spread quickly through the legal community. Within weeks, she was booked solid, with events for law firms, judges, and prominent attorneys. Sarah offered her a full partnership in the catering business, recognizing that Margaret's touch was elevating their reputation to new heights. Meanwhile, David continued his pattern of selfish behavior, completely oblivious to his mother's growing success and independence. He would call sporadically, usually when he needed something or wanted to complain about his life. Margaret listened politely, but no longer dropped everything to accommodate his needs. The collision between Margaret's new life and David's expectations came during the 4th month of her transformation. David called on a Tuesday evening, his voice carrying that familiar tone of entitlement that Margaret had once found endearing, but now recognized as manipulation. "Mom, I need you to do me a huge favor. I'm trying to impress this new client, Harrison Development Group. They're worth millions, and if I can land them, it'll make my career. I want to invite the CEO and his wife to dinner, but it needs to be somewhere impressive." Margaret waited for him to continue, knowing exactly where this was heading. "I was thinking you could cook one of your amazing meals, but obviously not at your place. I'll pay for you to cater it at my house. You know, make it look professional and elegant. Rebecca can help serve, and it'll be perfect." Margaret felt the old familiar tug of wanting to help her son succeed, but she also felt something new, indignation at his presumption that she would drop everything for him while he continued to treat her as hired help rather than his mother. "I'm sorry, David, but I can't do that," she said calmly. "What do you mean you can't?" "Mom, this is really important. I need this client. I mean, I have my own business commitments now. I can't take on additional catering jobs on short notice." David's voice sharpened with irritation. "Business commitments? Mom, you're helping Sarah with her little catering thing as a hobby. This is my actual career we're talking about." Margaret felt her temper flare at his dismissive tone. "My little catering thing is a successful business partnership, David. and my time is just as valuable as yours. Look, Mom, I'll pay you. I know money is tight for you, so consider this a good opportunity to make some extra cash. The condescension in his voice was too much. David, I don't need your money. I'm doing quite well on my own, thank you. There was a long pause. What's gotten into you lately, Mom? You've been acting really strange. This attitude isn't like you. Maybe you never bothered to learn what I'm actually like, Margaret replied, surprising herself with her directness. Maybe you've been so busy thinking of me as your personal servant that you never considered I might be a person with my own goals and capabilities. David's voice turned cold. Fine. If you're too busy to help your own son, I'll figure something else out. But don't come crying to me when your catering experiment falls apart and you need help paying rent. After he hung up, Margaret sat quietly, for a moment processing the conversation. In the past, David's disappointment would have sent her into a spiral of guilt and self-doubt. Now she felt only a sad clarity about how little her son actually respected her. Her phone rang again an hour later. This time it was Sarah. Margaret, you're not going to believe this. Judge Morrison recommended us to cater the annual partners dinner at Crawford Wells and Associates. It's the biggest law firm in the city and they want to meet with us tomorrow. Crawford Wells and Associates was David's dream firm, the prestigious practice he had been trying to join for years. Margaret felt a strange twist of fate in the coincidence. The meeting the next day exceeded all expectations. The senior partners were impressed by Margaret's vision for their annual dinner, and the budget they offered was more than Sarah's company, typically made in 3 months. Margaret would be planning and executing the most important legal event of the year. As they drove away from the meeting, Sarah was practically bouncing with excitement. Margaret, do you realize what this means? This is the kind of client that establishes us as the premier catering company in the city. Every law firm, every corporate event, every high society gathering will want to book us after this. Margaret smiled, but her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about David's dismissive comments about her little catering thing, and his assumption that she would always be available to serve his needs. Soon, he would discover just how wrong he had been about his mother's capabilities. That evening, Margaret did something she had never done before. She called David back. David, I wanted to let you know that I hope your dinner with the Harrison Development Group goes well. I'm sure you'll figure out a way to impress them. David's voice was still cold from their earlier conversation. Thanks, I guess. I found a restaurant that can handle it, though it's going to cost me a fortune. I also wanted to share some good news with you, Margaret continued. My business partnership with Sarah has landed us the contract to cater the annual partners' dinner at Crawford Wells and Associates. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Margaret could practically hear David's mind racing as he processed this information. Crawford Wells and Associates was the holy grail of his professional ambitions, and his mother, the woman he had dismissed as needy and embarrassing, had just secured a contract with them. You're catering for Crawford Wells. David's voice was small and confused. Yes, we are. It's a wonderful opportunity for our company. I should let you go, though. I have a lot of planning to do. Take care, David. Margaret hung up the phone, feeling a satisfaction she had never experienced before. For the first time in her relationship with her son, she held the power. She had something David wanted, access to the firm of his dreams, and he had just learned that his embarrassing mother was more successful and respected than he had ever imagined. The irony wasn't lost on her. While David had been busy dismissing her worth, Margaret had been building a reputation that could open doors he had been trying to breach for years. The question now was what she would do with this newfound power, and whether David was capable of learning the lesson she was about to teach him. David couldn't sleep that night. He paced around his expensive house trying to process the bombshell his mother had just dropped. Crawford Wells and Associates wasn't just any law firm. It was the most prestigious practice in the state, the kind of place where careers were made and legends were born. He had been trying to get their attention for 5 years, sending his resume, networking at every legal event, even playing golf at their country club hoping to run into the senior partners. And now his mother, the woman he had dismissed as an embarrassing relic of his humble past, was catering their most important annual event. The next morning, David called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. He needed to understand what had happened to his mother, and more importantly, how he could use this connection to advance his own career. He drove to Margaret's apartment, expecting to find her pottering around in her old robe, available for whatever conversation he needed. Instead, he found a note on her door. Gone to meeting with vendors. Back later. David was stunned. His mother had meetings with vendors? What kind of operation was she running? He waited in his car for 2 hours before Margaret finally returned, but she wasn't alone. A well-dressed woman in her 50s was with her, and they were deep in animated conversation about flowers and table settings. David. Margaret seemed genuinely surprised to see him. What are you doing here? I wanted to talk to you about your news last night. This is Sarah, I assume. David extended his hand to the other woman, turning on the charm he used with potential clients. Sarah shook his hand politely but without warmth. So you're David. Margaret has told me so much about you. Something in Sarah's tone made David uneasy, but he pressed on. Mom, I was hoping we could chat privately about your catering contract. Margaret looked at her watch. I have about 15 minutes before my next appointment. Would you like some coffee? As they sat in Margaret's newly renovated kitchen, which David barely noticed despite the dramatic improvement, he struggled to find the right approach. The old dynamic where he could simply tell his mother what he needed and expect her compliance seemed to have evaporated. So, Crawford Wells, he began carefully. That's pretty impressive, Mom. How did you land that account? Through hard work and reputation, Margaret replied simply. Judge Morrison recommended us after we catered his retirement party. David leaned forward eagerly. Judge Morrison? He's golf buddies with Thomas Crawford, the senior partner. Mom, this could be incredible for both of us. I mean, you'll be working directly with the firm I've been trying to join for years. Margaret studied her son's face, seeing the familiar, calculating expression she had once mistaken for ambition, but now recognized as self-serving opportunism. What exactly are you suggesting, David? Well, you'll have access to all the partners, right? You could mention my name, maybe put in a good word for me, tell them about my experience, my track record. It would be the perfect inside connection. Margaret set down her coffee cup carefully. David, are you asking me to use my professional relationship with a client to advance your career? Not use exactly, just, network. It's how business works, Mom. People help each other out. The way you helped me out when I asked you not to treat me disrespectfully in front of your friends? David shifted uncomfortably. That's different. This is business. No, David. This is me being expected to solve your problems while you continue to show me no respect. That's not business. That's the same pattern we've always had, just with higher stakes. David's frustration began to show. Mom, I don't understand what's happened to you lately. You're being so stubborn and difficult. We're family. Family helps each other. Margaret felt the familiar guilt trying to creep in, but she pushed it away. Family respects each other, David. Family treats each other with kindness and consideration. When was the last time you asked how I was doing without wanting something from me? David opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. He couldn't remember. I need to get ready for my next meeting, Margaret said, standing up. Thank you for stopping by. Mom, wait. Look, maybe I haven't been the most attentive son lately. I've been busy with work and I know I don't call as much as I should. But this opportunity could change everything for me. Surely you can understand that. Margaret paused at the kitchen doorway. I understand perfectly, David. I understand that you see me as a tool to get what you want rather than as a person deserving of respect and love. I understand that you're only interested in my life when it can benefit yours. And I understand that you learned nothing from how you treated me in front of your friends. David watched his mother walk away, feeling more confused and frustrated than he had ever been. This wasn't how their relationship worked. Margaret was supposed to be supportive and accommodating, not challenging and independent. He had no idea how to handle this new version of his mother. Over the next 2 weeks, David tried various approaches to repair the relationship and gain access to Margaret's Crawford Wells connection. He sent flowers with a generic apology card. He called and left cheerful voicemails about wanting to take her to dinner. He even showed up with groceries, assuming she would appreciate the gesture. But Margaret was busy with the biggest event of her career, and she had no time for David's transparent attempts at manipulation. She was working 16-hour days, coordinating, with florists, musicians, caterers, and venue managers. She was traveling to meetings, tasting menus, and managing a team of servers. For the first time in her life, Margaret was completely absorbed in work that fulfilled and challenged her. David's calls went unreturned. His text messages received brief, polite responses. His attempts to drop by were met with locked doors and absence. Margaret was never rude or hostile, but she was completely unavailable to him in a way that drove him to distraction. The breaking point came when David ran into Jennifer at the grocery store. She was shopping with little Emma, and David approached them with forced casualness. "Jennifer, what a surprise, how have you been?" Jennifer's expression was cool but polite. "Hello, David. I'm well, thank you. I heard you've been spending time with my mom lately," David said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Your mom is wonderful. Emma and I love our visits with her." David watched Emma toddle around the cart, chattering happily about Grandma Maggie, and felt a stab of something he couldn't identify. "It's just a little strange, you know? Staying in touch with an ex's family." Jennifer's eyes flashed with anger. What's strange is a son who forbids his mother from maintaining friendships with people who care about her. What's strange is treating a woman who sacrificed everything for you like she's an embarrassment. David was taken aback by Jennifer's directness. "I don't know what she told you, but..." "She didn't tell me anything, David. I saw how you treated her when we were dating. I was young and didn't speak up then, but I should have. Your mother is one of the kindest, most generous people I've ever known, and she deserves better than the way you treat her." Jennifer pushed her cart away, leaving David standing alone in the cereal aisle, forced to confront an uncomfortable truth about himself that he had been avoiding for years. That night, David sat in his perfectly appointed house, surrounded by all the symbols of success he had worked so hard to achieve, and felt more alone than he ever had in his life. His mother was thriving without him, building a successful career and meaningful relationships while he had been taking her love for granted. His ex-girlfriend saw him more clearly than he saw himself, and the career opportunity he desperately wanted was in the hands of the woman he had spent years dismissing and disrespecting. For the first time in his adult life, David began to understand that success without character was just an expensive form of emptiness. But understanding the problem and fixing it were two very different things, and he had no idea where to begin. The night of the Crawford Wells & Associates partners' dinner arrived like a storm David had been dreading for weeks. He knew his mother would be there, orchestrating the most important legal event of the year, while he sat at home knowing he had burned the bridge that might have led to his dream job. Margaret had been preparing for this evening for 2 months. Every detail had been planned and replanned. The menu featured dishes that told the story of the firm's 40-year history. The decorations honored past partners while celebrating current achievements. Even the music playlist had been carefully curated to create the perfect atmosphere for networking and celebration. Sarah watched Margaret put the finishing touches on the centerpieces and marveled at her partner's transformation. "You know, when you first came to me 6 months ago, I thought you were just a sweet woman looking for something to do with her time. I had no idea I was gaining a partner with this level of vision and talent." Margaret smiled, adjusting a flower arrangement. "I had no idea either. I spent so many years thinking I was only valuable as someone's mother that I forgot I might be valuable as myself." The guests began arriving at 6 o'clock, and Margaret watched from the kitchen as the city's most powerful attorneys filled the elegant ballroom. She recognized many faces from newspaper articles and legal journals, but she felt no intimidation. These were her clients now, and she was here as a successful professional, not as someone's embarrassing mother. Thomas Crawford, the senior partner, approached the kitchen personally to compliment Margaret on the evening's setup. "Ms. Patterson, I've been to hundreds of these events over the years, and I've never seen anything quite this thoughtful and elegant. You've managed to make a business dinner feel like a celebration. Thank you, Mr. Crawford. That's exactly what I was hoping to achieve. As the evening progressed, Margaret moved seamlessly between the kitchen and the dining room, ensuring every guest felt welcomed and every detail remained perfect. She was in her element, commanding respect and admiration from people who had never had reason to notice her before. Around 8 o'clock, just as the main course was being served, Margaret noticed a commotion near the entrance. David had somehow talked his way past security and was standing in the doorway, scanning the room desperately. He was dressed in his best suit and trying to project confidence, but Margaret could see the panic in his eyes. She watched as he approached various partners, attempting to introduce himself and clearly hoping to make connections. Each interaction was politely brief, and Margaret could see David's desperation growing with each failed attempt to make an impression. Margaret felt a complex mix of emotions watching her son stumble through the room. Part of her felt the old maternal instinct to rescue him, to smooth his path and make introductions that could help his career. But a larger part of her felt sad that he had resorted to crashing a professional event, rather than simply asking for her help with humility and respect. David finally spotted her near the kitchen entrance and made his way over, his face flushed with embarrassment and determination. "Mom, I need to talk to you," he said urgently. Margaret glanced around the bustling event she was managing. "David, I'm working. This isn't the time or place for a personal conversation. Please, just 5 minutes. I know I screwed up, but this could change everything for me." Margaret looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw something she hadn't seen in years. Behind the desperation and manipulation, there was genuine vulnerability. The confident, dismissive man who had humiliated her 6 months earlier was gone, replaced by someone who looked lost and afraid. "Kitchen. 5 minutes," she said quietly. In the relative privacy of the catering area, David struggled to find words. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said, about how I treat you, and I realize I've been a terrible son." Margaret continued checking serving trays, not making it easy for him. "What do you want, David?" "I want to apologize. Really apologize, not just because I need something from you, but because I've been wrong for so long I don't even know how to be right anymore." Margaret paused in her work and looked at him directly. "Go on." "I took you for granted. I thought because you were my mother, your love was guaranteed no matter how I acted. I was embarrassed by where I came from instead of proud of what you sacrificed to get me where I am. I treated you like a servant, instead of the woman who gave up everything for my success." David's voice cracked slightly. "And the worst part is I didn't even realize I was doing it until you stopped letting me get away with it." Margaret felt her heart soften slightly, but she wasn't ready to forgive so easily. "What changed, David?" "Why now?" "Because I've been watching you these past few months and I finally see who you really are. You're not just my mother. You're Margaret Patterson, a successful businesswoman who commands respect from judges and lawyers and everyone who meets her. You built something amazing while I was busy being ashamed of you." He took a shaky breath. "And because I realize that all my success means nothing if I don't have the love and respect of the person who made it possible." Margaret studied her son's face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation. But for the first time in years, she saw only sincerity and pain. "David, I need you to understand something. I will always love you, that will never change. But love doesn't mean accepting disrespect. If you want a relationship with me, it has to be based on mutual respect and genuine caring, not just when you need something from me." "I understand," David said quickly. "I want to learn how to be better. I want to earn back your respect." Margaret glanced at her watch. She needed to get back to managing the event, but she could see that David was genuinely struggling with emotions he wasn't used to handling. "David, I appreciate your apology, and I believe you mean it. But apologizing isn't enough. You need to change how you treat people, not just me. The partners in that room can see right through false charm and manipulation. They value character and integrity." David nodded miserably. "I know, I thought if I could get in front of them, I could somehow convince them to give me a chance." You can't shortcut your way to respect, David. You have to earn it through consistent actions over time. Will you help me? David asked quietly. Not with the job. I mean with learning how to be a better person. Margaret felt the walls around her heart crack slightly. This was the son she remembered from childhood. Vulnerable, teachable, and genuinely seeking guidance. I need to finish this event, she said. But yes, I'll help you. We can start by you learning to respect other people's time and professional commitments. David's face flooded with relief. Thank you, Mom. I know I don't deserve another chance, but I promise I'll do better. Don't promise me, David, show me. And it starts with you leaving this event gracefully and allowing me to do my job without interruption. David nodded and turned to go, then stopped. Mom, the event is incredible. You should be proud of what you've accomplished. After he left, Margaret stood in the kitchen for a moment, processing the conversation. She felt cautiously hopeful but also realistic about the challenges ahead. David's apology seemed genuine, but changing deeply ingrained patterns of behavior would take time and consistent effort. Thomas Crawford appeared in the kitchen doorway, startling Margaret from her thoughts. Ms. Patterson, I hope you don't mind the interruption. I wanted to personally thank you for this extraordinary evening. The feedback from our guests has been overwhelmingly positive. Thank you, Mr. Crawford. That means a great deal to me. I also wanted to mention that we'll be hosting several more events this year, smaller affairs but important to the firm. Would your company be interested in handling those as well? Margaret felt a surge of professional pride. We would be honored to discuss those opportunities with you. Excellent. I'll have my assistant set up a meeting next week. Thomas paused. I also couldn't help but notice the young man who was here earlier. He mentioned he was your son? Margaret tensed slightly, wondering if David's behavior had reflected poorly on her professionalism. Yes, that was David. I apologize if he caused any disruption. Not at all. Actually, I was impressed by how discreetly you handled the situation. It showed real professionalism and grace under pressure. Thomas smiled. He mentioned he's an attorney. If he's inherited even half of your character and work ethic, he must be quite talented. Margaret felt a complex mix of emotions, pride in the professional respect she had earned, and a glimmer of hope that perhaps David's reputation wasn't as damaged as she had feared. Thank you, Mr. Crawford. That's very kind of you to say. As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, Margaret supervised the cleanup with the same attention to detail she had brought to every other aspect of the event. Sarah found her in the kitchen, counting linens and checking inventory. Margaret, you realize what just happened, right? Thomas Crawford basically offered us an exclusive contract with the most prestigious law firm in the city. We're going to be booked solid for the next 2 years. Margaret smiled, feeling exhausted but triumphant. We did good work tonight. You did amazing work. And I have to ask, was that really your son who showed up earlier? Margaret nodded. That was David. It's complicated. I'm sure it is. But if it helps, he looked like someone who... 6 months later, Margaret stood in her new office overlooking the city center, reviewing proposals for 3 different corporate events scheduled for the following month. Patterson and Associates Catering had become the most sought-after event planning company in the region, with a waiting list that stretched into the following year. The transformation in her life still amazed her sometimes. She had her own company, her own staff, and her own reputation built on merit rather than relationships. The scared, apologetic woman who had once begged for her son's attention felt like a different person entirely. Her assistant knocked on the Dr. frame. Margaret, your 3 o'clock appointment is here. David walked into her office carrying a small bouquet of daisies, her favorite flowers, which he had forgotten she loved until recently. He looked different too. Gone was the arrogant confidence that had masked his insecurity. In its place was a quieter, more genuine presence that reminded Margaret of the boy she had raised. Hi, Mom. Thank you for making time to see me. Margaret gestured to the chair across from her desk. These weekly meetings had become a ritual over the past few months. David's idea, not hers. He had asked if they could have regular conversations where he could learn to be a better son and a better person. "How was your week?" Margaret asked, accepting the flowers with a small smile. "Busy. I'm working on a pro bono case for a family, facing eviction. It's not glamorous work, but it feels more meaningful than corporate contracts." This was another change in David that Margaret was still adjusting to. After the disastrous evening at the Crawford Wells dinner, David had taken a hard look at his priorities and made some significant changes. He had started taking pro bono cases, volunteering at the legal aid clinic, and generally trying to use his skills to help people rather than just advance his career. "Tell me about the family," Margaret said. David's face lit up as he described Maria Santos, a single mother of 3 who was fighting to keep her apartment after her landlord attempted an illegal rent increase. As he talked about the case strategy and the children's school situation, Margaret could see genuine caring in his expression. "I've been thinking about what you said months ago, about how success without character is just expensive emptiness." David continued. "I realized I had become exactly that. Successful on paper, but empty inside." Margaret nodded, remembering that conversation. It had taken place during one of their first meetings after the partners' dinner, when David was still struggling to understand why his old approach to life wasn't working anymore. "How are things with Rebecca?" Margaret asked. David had been dating Rebecca for over a year, but Margaret had only met her twice, and both times had been brief, awkward encounters. David shifted uncomfortably. "We broke up last month," Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You didn't mention that last week." "I was still processing it," she said. David paused, clearly struggling with how to phrase this. "She said I was using our relationship the same way I used everything else, as a stepping stone to something better." She was probably right. Margaret felt a familiar pang of maternal concern, but she also recognized that David was learning important lessons about how his behavior affected others. "I'm sorry it didn't work out." "I'm not, actually. I'm sad, but I think I needed to hear those things. I've been using people my whole life without even realizing it. Even these meetings with you, part of me wonders if I'm just manipulating you in a more subtle way." Margaret appreciated his honesty, even though it was painful to hear. "What do you think?" "I think I'm trying to change, but I don't always trust my own motives. Sometimes I catch myself calculating how to get something I want instead of just being genuine." This level of self-awareness was new for David, and Margaret found it encouraging even as it revealed how deep his problems had been. David, changing fundamental patterns takes time. The fact that you're aware of these tendencies is progress. "I've been thinking about something Jennifer said to me," David continued. "She told me that I never learned how to have relationships based on mutual respect because I always had you as a safety net. No matter how badly I behaved, you would always forgive me and bail me out." Margaret felt a stab of guilt. "Are you saying I enabled your behavior?" "I'm saying I took advantage of your love in ways that weren't fair to either of us. You deserved better, and I needed to learn that actions have consequences." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both reflecting on the complex dynamics that had shaped their relationship for decades. "I have some news," Margaret said eventually. "Thomas Crawford called yesterday. They want to offer me a position as their in-house event coordinator. It would mean giving up my own company, but it's an incredible opportunity." David's face immediately lit up with excitement, and Margaret could see him starting to calculate the implications for his own career before catching himself. "That sounds amazing, Mom. What are you thinking about it?" Margaret studied her son's expression, looking for signs of the old manipulative patterns. She saw the moment he realized what he was doing and made a conscious effort to focus on her needs rather than his own opportunities. "I'm torn," Margaret admitted. "I love having my own business, but this would be steady income and incredible benefits. Plus, I'd be working with some of the most interesting legal minds in the country." "What does your gut tell you?" "That I've earned the right to make decisions based on what's best for me, not what might indirectly benefit someone else." David winced slightly at the implication but nodded. "You absolutely have. And whatever you decide, I'll support it without any expectations or hidden agendas. Margaret felt a warmth toward her son that she hadn't experienced in years. This was the man she had hoped he would become, thoughtful, self-aware, and genuinely concerned about others. "There's something else," Margaret said. "Jennifer and Michael are getting divorced." David looked genuinely surprised and concerned. "I'm sorry to hear that. Is she okay?" "She's struggling, but she's strong. She's been a good friend to me, David. I hope you understand why I couldn't give up that friendship just because your relationship ended. I understand completely. I was wrong to ask you to do that. Jennifer is a wonderful person, and I'm glad she has you in her life." Margaret felt another small piece of her heart heal. For months she had been protecting herself from hope, afraid that David's changes were temporary or superficial. But conversation by conversation, week by week, he was proving that real change was possible. "I've been thinking about Sunday dinners," David said unexpectedly. "What about them? I know I haven't been the most reliable about family time lately. I was wondering if you'd be interested in starting a weekly tradition. Nothing fancy, just regular time together where we can talk and catch up." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Sunday dinners had been a tradition when David was young, something they had both looked forward to each week. The tradition had died out as David became busier and more self-absorbed, and Margaret had missed it more than she had ever admitted. "I would love that," she said softly. "Good. And Mom, I want you to know that I'm proud of you, not just for your business success, but for having the courage to demand better treatment from everyone in your life, including me. You taught me what self-respect looks like." Margaret stood up and walked around the desk to hug her son. For the first time in years, it felt like hugging the child she had raised rather than the stranger he had become. "I love you, David. I always have and I always will. But I love myself too now, and that makes all the difference." As David left her office that day, Margaret looked out her window at the city below. She thought about the scared, apologetic woman who had served lunch to her son's friends 8 months earlier, accepting humiliation because she thought love meant accepting anything. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood that real love, for others and for yourself, required boundaries, respect, and mutual consideration. Margaret had saved her relationship with her son by refusing to accept his disrespect, and in the process, she had saved herself. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Sarah, calling about the Henderson wedding they were planning for next month. As Margaret switched into work mode, discussing flowers and menu options, she reflected on how full her life had become. She had meaningful work, genuine friendships, self-respect, and a son who was finally learning how to love her properly. Some paybacks, Margaret realized, weren't about revenge. Sometimes the best payback was simply refusing to accept less than you deserved, and building a life so fulfilling that the person who hurt you could see exactly what they had been taking for granted. David's transformation hadn't been punishment. It had been the natural consequence of finally encountering a woman who knew her own worth. And that, Margaret thought as she planned another successful event, was the most satisfying victory of all.